third and the last section now. And I'm really going to talk about responsibilities. And what I mean is mine. So you ought to say mine as well, because I'm not talking about your responsibilities, I'm talking about my responsibilities. These are my obligations. These aren't optional extras that I can choose or not choose as I feel fit. These are laid down. These are commands. These are part of God's ordinances. Lots of different churches, of course, do kind of facilitate the giving in different ways. And I've been to just about kind of most different kinds of churches where they've got this. I remember going to one church where they split up their tithes and their offerings. So at a particular point in the meeting, people would bring forth their tithes. And they would. There was a big Bible at the front, and they would all kind of process down, and they'd put their tithes on the Bible. And then they'd all go back in their seats. And they said, this was their teaching, they said, well, this is your obligation to God. Now, you're only just paying your debts if you're paying your tithe. This is what they say. This isn't what I say. This is what they say. But then when they finished the tithing, they collected all that money up, and they said, now we'll have an opportunity for people to give their gifts to the Lord. And there was another kind of series of people who came down and brought all these kind of gifts. And I think they actually used the tithes in that particular church for the support of the staff, if you like, the ministry of one kind or another. And their gifts they use for all kinds of other things, for keeping the roof on and for missionary work and all sorts of other kinds of things. And then, of course, we've got our own kind of unique way of doing things here in the church, which is kind of the mystery of the brown envelopes. People can be part of this church for a long time before they discover how we actually give in this church. It isn't supposed to be an official secret. It's just kind of the way it's kind of worked. And maybe there are some ways that we could do this slightly different. And I'm not kind of advocating these. I'm just going to suggest them. Just suggest something. I'll tell you what. I went to a church at one point for quite a long time, and they did something that was very interesting in that they had a system like ours, where at the back of the church, as you enter in, there was a fairly inconspicuous box that you put your offerings into. And it would be very easy to kind of walk past that and not know it. So it wasn't begging, it wasn't kind of pushing it in people's face, but it was there. But then at a particular point of their meeting every Sunday morning, they would actually bring that box from the back of the meeting to the front and pray over it. Pray over the gifts that had been given. So it was as anonymous as it always had been, but it was no longer secret in the sense that no one knew what was happening. So it gave the church, I think, a sense and maybe a reminder as well of the fact that the church does this. God has ordained it to be like this. This isn't just an unfortunate necessity. This is an ordination that God has ordained that the church should support the ministry in these different ways. The pattern that we have here is we have these simple kind of brown envelopes, and you kind of write a name or something on it, and it goes into a little slip, a little slit where all the hymn books are kind of neatly hidden, and that's it. It's an interesting kind of pattern, and I'm not an elder now, but I think I can say this, that I think the elders have always wanted just simply to, I've used this word before, to facilitate, to give an opportunity for the saints to give without making it too complicated, but at the same time not to put demands upon people and not to kind of put false expectations on people. So this has been their particular way of sort of doing it. And there may be other ways of doing it, but that's kind of the pattern that we've had. But there may be other ways in which you can maintain all the good of both systems in some ways. Okay, this quite some years ago now, I wrote this little leaflet that I call Money Matters, and I found it again today. And as I read it, I thought, well, this is exactly what I want to say, and I don't want to say any more than this. So I'm going to read it. There it is, if you've never read this. There used to be little leaflets at the back of the hall, and people could just pick this up. And I think it was called Money Matters. Oh, do we still have them? We still. Yes. Okay, it's something like this anyway. There were different sections. One section was called One of Another. Maybe you remember that's one of the little phrases that you get in the Bible. One another, one another. In other words, it speaks of connection and mutuality. In early Christian times, the believers had a strong sense of belonging to each other. During the earliest times of the church, they instinctively cared for each other as they were able. Speaking of those times, the scriptures tell us that great grace was upon them all. That's Acts chapter 4. Those who had practical or financial needs were helped by those who had the resources through the local fellowship of believers. The scriptures here are not describing an ecclesiastical organization or some short-lived experiment with communism. It's just simply a historical account of the way in which the Spirit of God was leading his people in the ordering of their lives. When they knew there were needs, they responded to them. And sometimes they organized their response because there was a need for administration of some of the things that we're doing. But it was never laid down in a church manual. It was simply instinctive. And I think the instinct is still there. And I think the actual organization by which we do this is in many ways less important. I think that's a kind of a, whatever works for us, whatever we're happy with, I think that's fine. Okay. They were simply being Spirit taught to consider the well-being of others, not looking to their own personal needs alone, but watching out for the needs of others. Remember, Paul wrote to the Philippians and said, let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. And as the fellowship of God's people spread into other places, so too this sense of caring for each other spread. The fellowship in one locality spontaneously reaching out to care for others that they knew to be in need. And maybe you remember this passage in Acts chapter 11, when Paul goes to Antioch, and Barnabas is there as well. It says, in these days prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. Then the disciples, listen, this is part of the answer to our question, the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. This is not a rule. This is not anything that's legislated and written down. This is just simply instinctive. The brothers in Antioch, when they hear of the need in Jerusalem, their immediate response is, how can we help? And how can we get our help to them? And it was actually these kind of sort of helps that provided part of the interconnection and the connectivity, the networking of the early Christian churches. It'll be helpful to notice that in none of these instances were the believers ordered to give. There was no legislation. The scriptures merely record the reaction of believers to the known need of others believers. Then the next section was on what I call proofs of love. In Paul's second letter to the fellowship of believers in Corinth, this is chapter 8 and chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians, he speaks about a collection which many other fellowships were making for the poor believers in Jerusalem. He uses many different terms to express this act of brotherly love. He refers to it as the grace of God. That's in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. If this is a strange idea to you or a new idea, let me explain what he's saying. Paul says that the people who send the gift are the people who've received the grace. You may have thought, well, the people who received the gift, aren't they the people who received the grace? Yeah, that's true as well. But actually the people who send the gift. He goes on to say this, and later he refers to fellowship. That's fellow sharing, partners together in something. And then he refers to serving the saints. And in one place, he speaks of it under another description when he calls it the proof of love. And when he says that, he doesn't mean the proof in the sense of without this evidence there's no love. It doesn't mean proof in that sense. It just means that this is an evidence of love. This is their love expressing itself. Love always has to express itself. This is a fundamental truth of God. God so loved that he gave. That is a little Bible axiom. People who love give. People cannot love and not give. It's just the way things are. So he refers to it as a proof of love. And he says this gift that he's encouraging the Corinthians to make now, he says this is your opportunity to demonstrate your love. This is your chance now to prove your love. But he doesn't mean that you don't love if you don't do it. This is just your opportunity. That's what he means. So he says, therefore show to them, this is 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 24, therefore show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. This is a familiar Bible theme. Genuine love must always express itself in giving. God so loved the world that he gave. It's not a law, it's a simple inevitability. Giving in one way or another is an inescapable consequence of love. Those who love give. Their love is an evidence in their giving. There are, of course, many different ways of giving, but the principles which can be seen at work here in the giving of money are equally true when it comes to sharing our time or our talents. Now, how shall we give? We come on to the next little section, cheerful givers. In the 8th and 9th chapters of the 2 Corinthians, there are very valuable insights into the principles that are at work in giving. And fundamental to all Christian giving, is that it is given willingly. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 7. This actually has to do with all giving, not just the giving of financial things. This is what he says, verse 7, so let each one give as he purposes in his heart. You see that? This is a very personal thing. Let each man be persuaded in his own mind, in his own heart. Let each one settle this thing before God, what they should do about this thing. Let each one gives as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly. That's to say, not with any hesitancy, or of necessity. That's to say, this is not a law. I know churches where you can't actually be a proper member of the church unless you commit to regular tithing. But that certainly is not what Paul is saying here. He says this kind of giving is not of necessity. It's not of that kind of order of things. And then he says this, for God loves a cheerful giver. And lots of people kind of make the point that the Greek word for cheerful here is hilarious. It really does mean very cheerful. It's a response. You know, if you've ever been in love, it isn't hard to give, is it? When you're in love, is it? It isn't. If you are able, if it's according to your ability, and you have the thing, it's a delight. It's your opportunity to do it. And this is the pattern here, that you do it cheerfully. That's why our kids get spoiled, and my wife gets spoiled, and I get spoiled. That's the way it is. For God loves a cheerful giver. And then there's this wonderful verse here, verse 8. There are some amazing verses that come into this section of what Paul has to say about giving here in 7 and 8 and 9. And this is one of them. He says, God is able. I love the verses which have the statement in God is able. There are quite a few of them in the New Testament, and this is one of the good ones. God is able. Literally, God has the dunamis. God has the power too. God has the power to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance of every good work. There's nothing mean or measured in this. There's nothing kind of pinched and, oh, well, we'll do our best. There's just such a glorious liberty in this verse, and it's one of the things that Paul is saying to the Corinthians, that that the Thessalonian Christians have been given with, being able to give with amazing generosity and with great joy, even though they themselves were actually poor. Let's go on a little bit. So there's no legal minimum standard in the new covenant as there was in the old covenant. But neither is it to be a casual or unconsidered action. It's not the kind of thing that you get in some churches. Well, oh, here comes the collection plate. Have I got any change with me? It's not that kind of thing happen. This giving begins in the heart. It doesn't begin when the collection box is rattled in front of you. You make your mind up before you get, whatever the pattern is, you make your mind up before you get to the meeting. This is a very careful, thoughtful, deliberate principle, a set of principles that are being worked out here. Let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly, nor of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness. Okay, so he says there's no legal minimum, but there is to be this very careful, thoughtful, considered decision. And this is the action according to every man's purposes in his heart. But neither is there to be any foolish or impracticable irresponsibility. But it's according to what a man has. In chapter 8, in verse 12. That isn't one. Oh yes, it is chapter 8 and verse 12. He says this. And this is another wonderful principle, not just for giving of money, but for all kinds of giving. Verse 12. For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have. You get some kind of preachers in some parts of the world who will encourage people to give more than they could afford. Because they'll say, God's shovel is bigger than yours. You shovel it out and God will shovel it in. You just keep giving. Don't worry about whether you can afford your mortgage or pay your debts off. Just keep on giving your tithe, keep on giving your money. God, that is not what Paul is saying here. There's none of that kind of recklessness that here. If at first there's a willing mind, it's accepted according to what one has and not according to what he does not have. While at the same time bearing in mind that he who sows bountifully shall also reap bountifully. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 6. And we've already mentioned this kind of wonderful verse about God's abundance. But what an amazing blend this whole giving is of free grace and faithful stewardship. How wonderful it is that God should give us an opportunity of sharing with him in loving and giving. And really what we've done in the church here, you don't mind me saying this, you elders, is that I think we've always just tried to facilitate these things. We've not tried to lay down rules and regulations. We've not tried to embarrass anybody. We just simply tried to facilitate this whole process. But I think it's good once every 30 or 40 years, regularly, every 30 or 40 years, to have one of these sessions where we actually say, actually this is not an option. This is not an option. This is part of one of God's ordinances. This is how God's economy functions. This is how the whole thing is knit together. So I'm going to stop now. Let's stop.